Welcome to ERA 101. We begin with Lady Justice at the top and center of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. The Constitution she defends on the inside of this building has never included her by her sex in its protections. It's a story you might want to know. We are a group of Mainers who came together in 2016 to learn about what happened to the Equal Rights Amendment. We were young women in 1972 when the ERA passed Congress and went to the states for ratification. Most of us, like most Americans, never realized that it never completed ratification. Most people don't know that without the ERA, the Constitution doesn't protect women or anyone from sex discrimination. We didn't know what had happened to the ERA until we looked into it deeply, and in the process came to understand how important it is. In the 1970s and 80s, with careers and families, we didn't pay attention to how the ERA foundered in the Reagan years. We didn't understand for another 40 years what forces defeated the amendment and continue to oppose any statement of legal rights for women in the Constitution. That's why we're here now, to tell you about it. In recent years, we have felt the rising awareness that unequal treatment of women persists. There are long-term patterns of bias that persist. We don't see the optimism among today's young women, the kind of optimism many of us felt, that change for the better was on its way, and we are seeing serious threats to the safety and well-being of women in general. We have laws that address injustices facing people because of their sex. We have examined the laws that work and those that don't work. We have learned that without firm constitutional footing, the laws are not enough. We are the only developed nation that does not have equal rights for women clearly stated in its written constitution. This country, and at the same time our state of Maine, face an historic opportunity to finally amend the Constitution to make it absolutely clear that Americans will not be treated unfairly because of their sex. We will cover these points. What is the Equal Rights Amendment? Its brief history, why we still need it, arguments for and against, and why particularly now we need it more than ever, and what our next steps are. The great majority of Americans think men and women should have equal rights under law. They think we already have them. They are mistaken. The ERA is how our founding documents will catch up with where we have moved as a democracy, giving half the population the rights and protections that have never been clearly laid out in the Constitution. By founding documents, we will be talking about two constitutions, the United States Constitution and the Constitution of the State of Maine. Neither one includes women in its full protections now. These are the words of the federal ERA, the words I remember from 1972. And this is the parallel amendment proposed as a state ERA for Maine's Constitution. In the previous session of the legislature, it was passed by the Senate, but stalled in the House without a single Republican voting in favor of women's legal rights. Under our legal system, equal treatment between the sexes under the law is viewed in terms of sex discrimination. Sex discrimination is deeply embedded in our history, and it is important to understand how the cultural bias that prevailed for centuries is at the core of many of the issues we face today. It helps to look back at where we began as a nation. English common law was the law of the land for the early settlers, the founders and the authors of the Constitution. For women, it meant being covered by their fathers, husbands, brothers, even sons. A married woman was a femme couverte, who could not own property, make contracts, vote, etc. Single women and girls were dependent for their civil rights on male relatives. Colonial women were well aware of the injustice of fighting for independence and yet not receiving equality of rights. You may have heard the words of Abigail Adams to her husband John Adams to remember the ladies as the nation's founding documents were being written. He failed to do that. The U.S. Constitution was written by and intended for white men of property. Women, slaves, Native Americans, and the poor by custom did not hold an equal place to white male citizens in the new nation. By the mid-1800s, women's suffrage and abolition of slavery were closely linked. Women and African slaves were excluded from the full rights of citizenship in the United States. Suffragists and abolitionists worked together for those rights leading up to the Civil War. This is Frederick Douglass on the left, the extraordinary voice for abolition of slavery and for the freedom from race discrimination. And Susan B. Anthony is on the right, the voice for the rights of women, and in particular the right to vote. They were friends, and they both lobbied Congress at the close of the Civil War. However, the debates over the 14th and 15th Amendments nearly tore apart the fragile peace of the nation following the Civil War, and Douglass had to choose to fight for the rights of freed black men at the expense of the rights of women in order to gain passage at all. It was quite clear at the time and in the text of the amendment that the 14th Amendment was not intended to include women in its Equal Protection Clause. The defeat to women's rights in the 14th and 15th Amendments was crushing. Leading up to the Civil War, suffragists and abolitionists had fought together for civil rights for slaves and for all women. It was hard enough to get the votes to give freed slave men their rights. It was apparently just too much to ask for women to be given the right to vote, much less full equality. For the next 50 years, women fought for the right to vote, for representation in a country that called itself a democracy. It was an ugly battle that was fought in every state in the Union as state legislatures voted down women's suffrage again and again. Finally, in 1917, women became the first picketers of the White House, effectively bringing the cause of suffrage to public view. The 19th Amendment passed Congress during World War I, and its ratification was a very close battle to the 38th state. At last, the 19th Amendment passed Congress and was fully ratified. It became the first and only mention of women's rights in the U.S. Constitution. But let's be clear about which women's suffrage we are talking about. Native American women still couldn't vote, and the Jim Crow terror had reduced African American suffrage to a near halt in most of the South and some northern states as well. Suffrage also brought the roles and rights of women into full view. The inequities were obvious to those who cared to look. The women activists who had brought about this enormous change immediately turned to all the other rights for women still absent from American law. Now that the vote was, at least on paper, legal, what about all the other aspects of full citizenship? On the heels of the 19th Amendment in 1923, Alice Paul wrote what would become the Equal Rights Amendment. She was a young suffragist who had studied law and traveled to England to learn from their suffragists to fight for women's equality. She had picketed the White House, standing in silence with a placard for which she and others were imprisoned many times. After the 19th Amendment did pass and was ratified, Alice Paul turned her attention to full equal rights for women. Her simple writing has stood up well over time. Equality of rights under the law shall not be abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And the marching for full equal legal rights began. Putting equal rights for women into the spotlight brought out the deeply held bias about women's place in society. That bias was at the core of the lack of fair representation by women in the government, in the laws, in the courts, in schools, in work, in all aspects of life. The ERA challenged those inequities and continued to do so, along with the marching, for the next 50 years. After the bipartisan vote passed both houses of Congress, and 35 states, including Maine, quickly ratified, the ratification process stalled, and there was enough opposition from the southern states to stop ratification. The states that refused to ratify the 19th Amendment are many of the same states that have yet to ratify the ERA. The opposition to the ERA held deeply embedded views that the proper place for a woman was to remain at home, not requiring equality because she was under the protection of her husband. Conservative white Christian politics and corporate interests combined to create a hostile environment for women's issues that would last for generations. Now, 40 years later, it's hard to believe we were arguing about shared bathrooms, women in the military, and same-sex marriages. And yet that's what killed the ERA in the 80s. So why do we still need it? Because current laws are incomplete and impermanent. Because sex discrimination is not considered as seriously as discrimination by race, religion, and national origin. And because it is only fair for women and girls to see their rights clearly protected in the founding documents. This takes us back to what sex discrimination is. Let's take a look at these key issues one at a time. First, the gender pay gap. That means what men and women earn for equal work. Then sexual harassment and sex discrimination in the workplace. Sexual violence, which includes domestic violence. And unfair access to medical care. The numbers here deserve our full attention. Together they show us where sex discrimination is a common element. Pay inequity can reveal a pattern of sex discrimination when it involves treating a group that is defined by their sex unfairly. Women now work in greater numbers, are more frequently heads of household, and contribute as breadwinners to their families. They should be paid fairly. An ERA would plug some significant loopholes in the laws requiring equal pay for equal work, give women a chance to know what their male cohorts are paid without retribution by the employer. It would give adequate time to lodge a complaint and not have their pay be based on previous employment, regardless of the position they are filling. It would no longer require that a victim of pay discrimination would have to prove that the employer intended to discriminate. It would set a principle of fairness for employment of women and men. Today is a very different world from 1923 and from 1972. Women now make up about half of the workforce. Work environments that used to tolerate sexual harassment are being called out. Still, 57% of young Mainers between the ages of 18 and 34 say they experience sexual harassment at work. In nearly half of two-parent families, both parents work. Pregnancy and family leave are clearly linked to economic stability for those families. Discrimination against women for their pregnancies is sex discrimination. It is a terrible waste of talent and productivity to train our young people for the workplace and then leave them to work and raise children without policies that support those workers and their families. An ERA would give constitutional footing to the Violence Against Women Act. The Act could then fulfill its mission by being founded in an ERA rather than, as it is, in the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Why the Commerce Clause, you might ask? Because there is no other reference in the Constitution to guarantee rights against crimes based on the sex of an individual. How is sexual violence considered sex discrimination? When a category of crime overwhelmingly victimizes one group, distinct by characteristics over which they have no choice, it is considered discriminatory. Women and girls are the majority of rape victims. Women are the overwhelming majority of domestic violence victims. Employed women are the majority of victims of harassment, workplace bias, and intimidation. poor women experience all of these crimes in far greater numbers than more privileged women. One lesser-known feature of the Affordable Care Act of 2010 is that it stopped unfair gender rating. Gender rating has been a common insurance industry practice. The unfair part is that higher premiums are charged to women without the statistical evidence of higher costs for women over the course of their lives. This long-held practice has cost women about $1 billion a year in unfair health insurance premiums prior to 2010. The ACA also compelled insurance providers to cover contraception as part of medical care for insured women. For the first time, essentially sharing the costs of family planning between the male and female participants. These two sex-related and widespread burdens would revert to women if the ACA were repealed. Let's look at some of the common arguments for and against an Equal Rights Amendment. But first, we want these two little animals to talk to each other, to see that they would both benefit similarly from the amendment. The ERA used to be a Republican, white, middle-class movement, opposed by big business and organized labor. And now in Maine, we are struggling to see a single Republican representative vote in favor of the amendment. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause is the most frequent argument we hear for why an ERA is unnecessary. Let's look more closely. The philosophy of the court since the 60s, as it has shifted from the Earl Warren Court to the John Roberts Court, is clear in its reading of sex discrimination. The majority of today's court are present and former members of the Federalist Society, which asserts that the original intent of the Constitution is to be used to understand its meaning. The record is clear about the attitude towards women's civil rights and what the intent was by those writing and authorizing the Constitution and the 14th Amendment. The record is also clear that the 14th Amendment is not likely to be stretched to cover the women it wasn't meant to include. Let's see what these two justices have to say. Justice Scalia: certainly the Constitution does not require discrimination on the basis of sex. The only issue is whether it prohibits it. It doesn't. And Justice Ginsburg: if I could choose an amendment to add to the Constitution, it would be the Equal Rights Amendment. I would like my granddaughters, when they pick up the Constitution, to see that notion, that women and men are persons of equal stature. I'd like them to see that as a basic principle of our society. If these two justices seem to agree on this point, that the Constitution is lacking the provision to protect against sex discrimination, then we needn't argue about whether or not we need an ERA to make it clearer. Let's amend the Constitution to reflect who we are as a nation now. The laws we have studied, which may on paper prohibit sex discrimination, are without the full force of the courts because they lack the clear constitutional language to prohibit it. Loopholes are found, enforcement is weak, and the laws can be entirely changed and repealed. Abortion is more restricted in some states with ERAs, like Pennsylvania and Texas, than in states without ERAs, like Maine. What we can see from the past is that with or without equality language in the state constitutions, legislatures will make laws regulating abortion at the will of the voters. Constitutional language is intended to provide the guidance by principle of our laws. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson took great care to put their founding values into words that would not curtail freedoms for future generations that they could not anticipate. They kept it pretty general. It was the protection of commonly held freedoms that the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment had to address. Times change, and they probably anticipated that fact. Most combat positions are now open to women, though women are not always compensated fairly for combat due to conflicting orders from Congress. The draft has been inactive since 1973 and may be far less necessary in crisis given the numbers of women that have joined the ranks. Our constitutions don't protect against the kind of unfair discrimination felt mostly by women. There is no reason for basic rights to be assumed or inferred or taken for granted. They haven't been granted. They should be stated clearly. Women are the largest group whose civil rights are not clearly supported by the Constitution. We know where the Constitution started. We need to follow up the 14th Amendment and the 19th Amendment with an Equal Rights for Women amendment. After 1982, the ERA lay dormant for 35 years. Not nearly as long as the Madison Amendment, now the 27th Amendment, which addressed congressional pay raises. It slept for 203 years before its full ratification in the 1990s. The time limit was placed on the ERA as a bargaining chip by the opposition, who opposed equal rights for women. They gambled, correctly, that the country would swing right, as it did in the Reagan years. With flipped state legislatures, 5 states even attempted to reverse their previous ratifications. The overwhelming support for the amendment in 1972 evaporated to a stalled amendment by 1982. However, in 2017, in defiance of the time limit, Nevada's legislature voted to ratify the ERA. Illinois followed in 2018, and by 2020, Virginia's legislature became the 38th state to ratify. What's next? The U.S. Congress will vote on removing the time limit. Then, challenges in the courts will test the legality of the time limit and the attempted rescissions by the state legislatures. If these court challenges succeed, we will have to start the whole amendment process again with a new ERA. How many more years will it take for American women to point proudly at their Constitution? Maine stands out in the nation as the only state with its full bipartisan delegation in support of the ERA and a governor who is an active proponent for equal legal rights for women. We are in an excellent position to lead other states in the drive toward constitutional support for women's legal rights. Let's talk about state constitutions. In Maine, we live in a state that ratified the federal ERA in 1974, and we have waited since then for its enactment. In the absence of a federal ERA, the Constitution of the state of Maine needs to be amended to fully include women. When it was written in 1820, women had very different rights of citizenship. A new bill proposes an amendment to the Constitution of the state of Maine, a state ERA, that specifically prohibits sex discrimination. States in blue have state ERAs. In gray, no ERAs. 3 yellow states have state ERAs that have passed 1 house in their state legislatures. The trend to pass state ERAs is on the rise. The Maine Human Rights Commission is where sex discrimination cases go in this state. We are lucky to have it. It is a bipartisan commission appointed by the governor, formed to administer the Maine Human Rights Act, and its discrimination cases often take about 2 years to resolve. The commission has a mandate from the legislature to address the green-checked issues: employment, housing, public accommodation, education, and credit. Yet sex discrimination in Maine has a much larger reach than those areas. We can do better. A state ERA would give the state a mandate to address those issues like domestic violence, violence against women, insurance and pension discrimination, and the incarceration of women. It would help combat those serious problems. Informing the public in all covered areas is also part of the mandate of the Commission and would go a long way toward giving equal justice to women in Maine who may not understand how to get help. We want Maine to set the record straight after 200 years of statehood. Our state constitution should clearly say that women have equal rights under the law and that sex discrimination against any Mainer is prohibited. Since 1979, there has been an international pact upholding equal rights for women. It has been signed by 187 member nations. The major nations who have not signed this pact are Iran, Somalia, Sudan, and the United States. Ratification of this treaty by the U.S. requires a Senate vote. It has been blocked for 40 years by the southern states of America. The chief opposition lobbyists have been paid by the same organizations as those who testified before the Maine Judiciary Committee last May against our state ERA, the Roman Catholic Church, and Concerned Women of America. We are paying a high price for the link between legal equality between women and men and the interests of particular religious organizations. That is our report on the Equal Rights Amendment. If you have questions or suggestions, be in touch with us. Far more people need to understand what is at stake with this amendment. Join us. Spread the word. Let's get this done.